third slide. This is the empire. So why don't we just start there, and then we'll get to the other one. Are we starting? We ready to go? All right. Welcome to class number 3 of Daniel, the book of Daniel, one of my absolute favorites. I love the book of Daniel, and I love history, so it all kind of goes together. We ended last time, remember, we emphasized something about Daniel. We emphasized the fact that Daniel had gone into captivity and made himself a man of the Spirit as he understood it with all those things. We talked about Azariah's prayer that talked about a broken spirit and a contrite heart, and they didn't have a sacrifice, and they understood it, but they walked in the ways of God, and they chose to do that, and everybody around them loved them, right? But then when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, just like Daniel later in the lion's den, has a bunch of enemies that they, convince the king, or the king decides to do something stupid, and then they say, King, our God can save us from the fire, certainly, but whether he does or not, we're not bowing down to your idol, and they get delivered, and we talked about that extensively. So the first 3 chapters of Daniel include Daniel chapter 2, the great image that we talked about, that we'll talk about more, that Nebuchadnezzar saw, but most of it's laying out who these guys are. They're the people of God. And so they're operating in the Babylonian Empire. Now this map, if you can follow it, here's that Mediterranean Sea that I tell you is like the big pool with a spa attached over here and a little kiddie pool over there. And it's just a way to kind of remember how this works, right? So this sea here, this Mediterranean basin, this is the place where everything is going on at this time. Everything's happening. And here's Jerusalem in this map, and here's showing you where Babylon is. And this empire of Babylon covers a huge, extensive area, much larger area, probably even than Assyria did, although Assyria also conquered this area at one point. They sacked the city of Thebes in Egypt in something like 660 something. So this is the Babylon Empire. Now, it was not this extensive when he took Jerusalem. He extended this out in various ways, and we're going to talk about those. But what is happening now in the life of Daniel is they are living in Babylon as members of the Babylon court. They are Chaldeans. They have been trained to do a job in the bureaucracy or however their job fit. Daniel obviously is now known as the interpreter of dreams. He doesn't even know what the dream is. He finds out from God what the dream is and the interpretation, which is pretty wild. And that's the empire they work in. They're not working in Israelites here. They're not working in the kingdom of Judah or anything like that. They're working in that empire. And what happens over time is Nebuchadnezzar extends it. Now, why is this going to be important? Just want you to understand it, because in the future, when we talk about this, we're going to be talking about how this one compares to the next one, compares to the next one, but we're just not doing that tonight. So now if we could switch to the other slide, and we're going to start reading in Daniel chapter 4, okay? Nebuchadnezzar, this is the king of this empire in which these guys are functioning, okay? He's the king unto all the people, all nations, languages that dwell in all the earth. This is what that picture we showed you, that is how they perceived it. The whole earth, everything that mattered was under Nebuchadnezzar. Now, were there peoples not under him? Absolutely. You keep going west and you're going to get to the Greeks and you're going to get to barbarians up in all these other places. You're going to get all kinds of things. And there's a lot going on in the east too that he's not a part of. But as far as they were concerned, the whole earth is under Nebuchadnezzar. That's how they looked at it. And he said, I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God has wrought toward me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. What is he doing? He's like preaching here. He's talking about how great God is. Remember just the chapter before, he tried to kill the 3 guys, right? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He tries to kill them and throw them in a fiery furnace, and then he sees there's a 4th man in there, right? And he gets serious about nobody say anything bad about this God. You think he would have got it from Daniel before? but he really got it this time. And remember that when Daniel was taken captive, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't even the king. He was the crown prince. We talked about that. And so it's early in his reign when Daniel does his thing. When he raises up the statue, must have been because he heard he had the dream, and I'm the head of gold, and he got excited, and so he made this really big statue. And then he gets slapped down, and God basically tells him. So what's he doing? He's proclaiming how great God is and what God has done and shown him. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. And he saw another dream. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. So he gets all the wise men together. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. So they're all different groups. They all have different ways. Some kill a chicken and look at the blood splatter. Some of them, look at the liver of a sheep. Who knows what they all do. They do all their stuff. And I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. So they know the dream now, but they don't get it. At least as far as we know, he told them what the dream was. He says that he told them the dream, but they didn't get it. And finally get to the last guy. Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubles thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I've seen and the interpretation thereof. So maybe he didn't tell him what it was. I don't know. Doesn't really say. Thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. Oh, and then now he's going to tell him. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. It's a big tree. See, this big tree. And the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. So, it's like taking care of the whole world. It's the shade, it's the food, it's everything, right? I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. Now, this is a term that gets used in some ancient literature talking about the watchers. If you read the book of Enoch, there's a lot of talk about the watchers. There's other places they're mentioned. But really, think of these as angelic beings. Every time I read that, until I got proof otherwise, I just think angelic being. A watcher and a holy one came down from heaven, and he cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, scatter his fruit, let the beasts get out from under it, and the fowls from his branches. So all the good things the tree was providing, this watcher comes down and says, wipe it all out. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. Wow, that's intense. That's the reason. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now, thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, forasmuch as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation. But you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So he knows this. He's got it pretty wired now. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for an hour. Now, who does that remind you of? Ezra. It reminds you of Peter, too. I was thinking Peter. Peter, who was, in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and he basically, he sees the vision, right? This is the Spirit of God moving. That's what I'm, huh?
John saw it on the Lord's day.
Yeah, John saw one on the Lord's day, but I'm talking about Peter when he was up on the roof. But anyway, we're getting there. Forgive us. So he's astonished for an hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my Lord, because this is who he serves now, the dream be to them that hate you, and the interpretation thereof to your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves are fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwell, and the branches, the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is you, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reaches unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher and a holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. This is the decree of the Most High, which is to come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he wills. He's making this very clear. We know that when Egypt was great, the people of God went down to Egypt, and Joseph was there, and he testified of the God of heaven. We know that when Assyria was not very great, that Jonah went to Nineveh and testified to them and preached to them, and they repented, and they became the greatest nation. We know that Nebuchadnezzar receives messages from God. We know that he receives dreams, and we know that he has people, Daniel and his friends, that are there to minister to him. God is not without his witness everywhere. Don't forget it. We will see that he's involved in the kingdom of the Persians, and that he has his witnesses. Just read Esther, and you'll know some of that, right? And we know that he testifies in Rome, because we know that when Jesus comes, that Rome becomes a Christian nation. And when we just know God is involved in every one of these things. People often think that he's not. No, he's telling you, the whole point of this discussion is to testify. If you don't get anything else out of it, get that out of it. Verse 26, and whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee after that you have known that the heavens do rule. Once you've got this and you got the message, after 7 times passed over you, you're going to know. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. So he's telling him, look, get serious about your righteousness, guy. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. And so it's going to say at the end of 12 months. But so for the next period of time, this isn't going to happen. He hears that this is going to be the interpretation, but he walks for about 12 months, and it hasn't happened yet. We're going to read about when it happens. But I want to comment on this, just so you understand, because you guys will all be able to download this from the website, okay? This is a timeline, 615 BC, in this case, all the way up to here, it's about 590 or so. And there's a second page. If you print it, sometimes I printed it in 3 pages. And it takes you through different places. This is all Egypt. I don't want you to spend a lot of time worrying about Egypt. We'll just comment on it. There's notes about Egypt. There's the kingdom of Judah. You see Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, all these guys down to Zedekiah. Some notes about those. Tyre, which will become important down here when we talk about it. Babylon, and notes about Babylon. And here's Nebuchadnezzar. He's crown prince here when Nabopolassar, his father, is the king. Here's where he begins. Here's the destruction down here of Jerusalem. And then down here is the Medes and eventually the Persians, just so you know. You're just following. This is just timeline stuff. It's helping you know. So here's where we are. We're in the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, and we're past here. Okay? So flip to the next one. Because he deals with Judah for a while, conquers it 3 different times, finally completely wipes it out. So if we can get to the next one. So why am I saying this? Because I want to comment on a couple other things, because I'm not going to have time to read all of it, because I want to get moving. We talked about the Apocrypha a little bit one time, the old Apocrypha. You can read a lot in that on Daniel, Bel and the dragon, and Daniel and Susanna, which are all testimonies of how Daniel operated in Babylon. Okay, and he basically called them on their false gods and their idol worship, and he also has a testimony like the Wisdom of Solomon, where he figures out how to save a woman who's righteous, who's now caught in people trying to kill her, Susanna. They come, they want to take advantage of her. She refuses, so they testify against her because they have 2 witnesses that she was with some other guy and had falsely lain with some other man who was not her husband, and they were going to condemn her, and Daniel says, no, 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 no. And then he gets the 2 guys separate, and he gets them to tell what they know, and finds the contradiction in their stories, and then calls them on it, and they actually end up in trouble. But so these are just testimonies. They're just fun things to know, that they help to fill out all these intervening years where Daniel and his friends are helping rule over Babylon, okay, so that you understand it. So we get here, and we're following Nebuchadnezzar down here, and Jerusalem's gone. This is when Gedaliah becomes the governor. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, and you're going to see that after this, there's this siege of this place called Tyre. This is extremely famous. The siege of Tyre. Tyre is an extremely powerful city off the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Remember the big pool over on the far eastern shore is Tyre, and it's a very important city. And he spends 13 years sieging Tyre. That's how powerful it is. Okay? Tyre should be, sound familiar to some of you, because in the Old Covenant, and we learn about the old stuff, he says, take now a lamentation on the prince of Tyrus. Take out a lamentation on the king of Tyrus. And Pastor Mark talked about in the Old Testament class about the king of Tyrus being representative of Satan and all of that. Well, that's Tyre. That's this one. And there's a bunch of stuff about this, the lamentation of Tyre, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, talking about this very fact that Tyre gets taken down. Tyre is the sister city of Sidon. Sidon is the city of Jezebel. Bad. Evil, okay? So just so you know, just kind of helping you understand what we're talking about. And we know who the king was. This king here is Ithabal III. That's the king who, during the siege of Tyre, he ends at that end. And right here is Nebuchadnezzar's mania, which we're about to read about. That's what this is. Then he comes back, and he's going to conquer Egypt, and we'll talk about that. So, 12 months, verse 29, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I've built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and the honor of my majesty? Bad policy to do that. Very bad. While the word was in the king's mouth, right then, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee until thou know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagles, and his nails like birds. They never got cut. And he's living. Now, there are many people who have tried to understand exactly what happened to him. I call it Nebuchadnezzar's mania because it's the word that we use to describe this kind of thing, but people use it for a lot of other things too. There are descriptions in medical literature of people who do things like this, that have various deficiencies and various problems and various mental diseases, that they end up acting like this. It's not that he turned into a beast, okay? It's important to understand. He was wrong in here, and he became very simple and not understanding what was around him, and he began to scratch at the ground and eat the grass and do all this stuff. And you can see that. Sometimes people start to argue, oh, he turned into a beast. No, he did not, okay? That's not what happened, okay? And that's what goes on here for 7 years during this period, around 570 BC. You can fit that in. Now, one of the problems with this is if you read the Babylonian Chronicles, because they exist on little clay tablets with all the little wedgies put into them, right, cuneiform, they end before the siege of Tyre. And we don't have the rest of it. It's like reading the book and the whole latter half is missing. So we don't have Chronicles for this time, and it's one of the reasons people have real troubles figuring all this out. But he has this mania here. And so that's the place that we're at. Late in his reign, many years after he began. Daniel's getting older now. And so I just wanted you to understand how we get here. Now, verse 34, at the end of the days, what days? 7 times. We have a time, it fits in there 7 years. Must have been somewhere around that amount of time, because 7 times passed over you. I'm assuming 7 years, but could it have been 7 months? I guess it could have been. Could have been 7 days. I guess it could have been, but we understand that to mean years. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes unto heaven. Now, notice, nobody killed him. I mean, you go read about ancient stuff. I mean, the king's weak, kill him, take his place. I mean, that would have been a common thing. Nobody did any of that. Why? Because God declared that would not happen. He declared it would not happen. And so that's a miracle in itself. To me, it's an absolute miracle. I lifted up my eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And what's the first thing he does? I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what do you do? At the same time, my reason returned unto me, for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and brightness returned unto me. My counselors, my lords, sought unto me. I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. So he was restored completely, just as God said he would be. Okay? Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride, he is able to bring them low. Boy, isn't that awesome? So he did this. Who made Nebuchadnezzar great? God did. It's testified very clearly. He's my instrument to accomplish my purposes. And so he gives him every opportunity to humble himself. He gives him every opportunity to acknowledge the God of heaven, because he loved him just as much as he loved any of you and me, right? So let me get back to this real quickly. So now we know what's going on. We've moved along in Nebuchadnezzar's world to here, okay? And I just want to comment on a few things that's important to know. Carthage, very famous city. Later on, if we ever talk about Rome, that's when it begins, and it's a offshoot of Tyre. Very interesting. There's a pharaoh up here that does stuff. And what happens is Nebuchadnezzar invades Egypt at this time. How do we know that he invaded Egypt? Because Ezekiel and Jeremiah say he did. Okay? Ezekiel was a captive prophet. Now, let me ask you this question. They're compiling, not many years from this time, they're compiling as we know, the Old Testament. Ezra and his scribes are going to compile the Old Testament. And they're going to take Ezekiel, and they're going to take Jeremiah and put them in prominent positions as what? True prophets. Do you think that if they said that Nebuchadnezzar conquered all of Egypt and made it so that nobody could live there, wiped the whole thing out, that it happened? Because if it didn't happen, would they be held up as true prophets? No, they would not. So it absolutely happened. Of course, if you read secular history, they'll tell you it didn't. So we are now this is one of those places where we deviate from secular history. We believe the Bible. Thank God, this actually happened. I believe you can prove it other ways, but we are not going to be talking about that. That's what all this is about. And they begin to occupy Egypt. That's why I showed you that Babylonian Empire map, and it included Egypt, because that's where it is. But then his reign, Nebuchadnezzar's reign, comes to an end. And there's this guy right here named Amel-Marduk, right there. And in the scripture, it tells us, and I can't read it, so I can't remember the address, but evil Merodach, the king of Babylon, lifted up Jehoiakim. Okay, that's him right there. He comes right after Nebuchadnezzar. And he takes Jehoiakim, who's basically been in prison, way back here. You can read about that in the Bible. He's in prison, and he lifts him up right there. And so that's where we are in Daniel's service in Babylon at this point. Okay? What comes after Amel-Marduk? This guy, Nergal-Shar-Usur, and then this guy, Nabonidus. Nabonidus People argue about whether he was truly a son of Nebuchadnezzar or something else. It doesn't matter for our purposes. But his son, Nabonidus' son, had a name. That name was Belshazzar. Okay? Because a lot of things, what will happen is people will say, well, who's Belshazzar? He was never king. Because he's not listed as a king of Babylon. But he's the son of the king. So what is his job? He's ruling Babylon. What do we know about his dad? You know what his dad was? One of the first archaeologists. His dad was a guy who used to leave his kingship and go walking around trying to find ancient artifacts. Okay, it's true. So that's what's going on. So I just want you to see that this is where we are. We're passing through all these years. Daniel's still alive as we get over here. Okay, everything I put on here is all related to Daniel. This is all Daniel stuff. You've probably heard of a guy named Croesus of Lydia. He's in there. What's going on? The Medes. Eventually they're going to take Croesus and take him down. And there's this guy here known as Cyrus, or Cyrus the Great. See where he shows up? He shows up as king of the Persians about the time that the successor to Amel-Marduk is there. Then you're going to learn about Cyrus. This is going to be very important in Daniel. We're going to talk about, remember we talked how accurate it is? Down to, detailed accuracy. We're going to find out about that in a little bit. And I thought this went further. Maybe it doesn't go further, but anyway, Belshazzar's are there. And what's going to happen is Cyrus is going to conquer it. And that's what chapter 5 is about. Chapter 5, you all know the story. This is many, many tekel upharsin, where he writes it on the wall. God comes with the finger and writes it on the wall and says, you've basically been judged, it's over. And just for the interest of time, oh, you found the other part. So it extended beyond. So here's Cyrus and here's Belshazzar as regent. You'll see that in your thing. The Persians gain control. They conquer Babylon here. And that is where we are in Daniel now. So I wanted to show you that. If you print that out and look at it, you want to spend some time with it, look at the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, and there'll be a whole lot of scriptures that will talk about various things. You can look them all up and sort of read what's going on. Just see how the Bible is like beautiful, how perfect it is, okay? And there's a million more things you could say about all that Chronicle stuff. Don't worry about it. It's not something you need to know, but it just gives you a picture that over that entire reign of Nebuchadnezzar reigned Daniel as one of the key chief guys. But when we get to this point, he's not going to be a chief guy. He's going to be a retired guy. Okay? That's what he really is. Because Belshazzar's having his big thing, and he gets the vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar stole. And I'm not going to read all this. I'm just going to skip through it. You can read it yourself. And in the same hour comes forth the fingers of a man's hand, writes over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall, and it writes these words. And he brings everybody in, who the usual suspects, right? Bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, right? All the guys. And they can't read it. And all the king's wise men, they could not read it. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled. His countenance was changed in him, and his lords are astonished. He's really upset. That's what's going on. And the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet house, and she tells him, look, there's a man that used to serve your father, okay? Nebuchadnezzar. He was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit of knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, dissolving of doubts, that's a great one, were found in the same Daniel, who the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you. So he gets him. He gets Daniel, and he comes and says, Daniel, I'll give you half the kingdom. And Daniel says, I don't need your kingdom, and I'll read it for you. And he's lifted up himself against the Lord of heaven, part of his hand. He talks about, I'm just going to skip to 25. This is the writing. Many, many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation. Many. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Finished it. Tekel. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. You say, wait a minute, Peres. I thought it was upharsin. Basically, Peres is a root of upharsin as I understand it. I'm not a linguist, so forgive me if I said that wrong, but it's something like that. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold on his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night, was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. 62. He's an old guy. And we'll talk about him, see how much time we have. But so that's what happens here. In this time, Daniel is still there, and he makes him a ruler of the kingdom, and that night it happens. Now, if you think about this for a moment, Babylon's this huge empire. What is going on? So if you study ancient Persian history, what you'll find out is that Cyrus and the Medes, just so you know, the Medes are this group of people up in the mountains and whatever. Shushan and Susa are all Median cities. They work with the Babylonians to defeat the Assyrians. Then they switch their allegiance to the Persians because Cyrus, this Cyrus guy, he basically deposes his father-in-law. He marries his daughter and takes over the Median kingdom. He becomes the king of the Persians and the Medes, or we say the Medo-Persian Empire. And that's who Cyrus is. Cyrus is prophesied by Isaiah. Tells us in a couple of places he's coming, right? And I'll post all those for you in the notes so you can look them up. But he tells that this guy's going to come. Why? Because God's the one who sets these people up. He does this. And he was very merciful to Nebuchadnezzar, giving him many opportunities to humble himself. So Cyrus comes down. He's been working to undermine the Babylonians all this time, because remember, the king is off on his archaeological expeditions, and he leaves his son as the regent, and that son isn't paying attention. And his entire kingdom is being eclipsed all around him. And so when they took Babylon, apparently, if you read about it, it wasn't a big battle. It just happened like that. It's like it was betrayed into the hands of Cyrus. Somebody just opened the gates and they walked in, found Belshazzar and killed him. And that was the end of Babylonian Empire. It ended just like that. Isn't that amazing? And that's what happened. And so Daniel is this ruler in the Babylonian kingdom at this time. And we're going to see, when we start next week, we're going to start talking about chapter 6. We're going to start learning about what goes on. And one of the things I told you about the accuracy is to understand that many people argue that there was no Darius the Mede. They don't know who he was, and they don't get it right. And we're going to talk about some Persian history, and we're going to lay all that out for you. But he is a Mede. He's not a Persian. He's Darius the Mede. He is joined with Cyrus, and he is probably the general who took over. And what you're going to read here is that in the first year of Darius the Mede, something happens. The next chapter, it's the first year of Cyrus the Persian. Because this general, whoever he was, that we call Darius the Mede, people argue that he's a different guy and different names, but that's typical in ancient history. He only ruled for about a year, and he died. So he's only there for a short time, and he's the one with the lion's den. Okay? So we'll talk about that next week. Guys, how many minutes do I have left? So I can decide where to go. Huh? 12 minutes. All right. So, because I don't want to get into the next part, because I know it's going to take me a lot longer. So I just want to rehash a little bit about this so that you understand. Number one, Daniel and his friends were people of God, very similar to Joseph. At this time in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, what was going on, the people of God, the people of Israel and Judah that have been left, are living in captivity. One of the guys in captivity is a man named Ezekiel. And Ezekiel is a great prophet. And he prophesies many things. And he's living in captivity. And if you look on that thing I gave you, if you print it out, you'll find where it says Ezekiel went into captivity here. And all the numberings of Ezekiel are basically based upon when he was taken captive. So you see where he was captive, and you'll know approximately where he is when he says in the 10th year of the captivity, in the 19th year of the captivity, all that. It's all him. Daniel and his friends went earlier than that. They were like the first wave. Ezekiel was in the second wave, and then there was a third. And so they're all living there. And we know a little bit about what it was like living there from a couple of other books. In the Apocrypha, there's 1st and 2nd Esdras, or Ezra. And you can read a lot about what's going on in Persia and how it was and all those kind of things at that point. In addition, you can read Esther and all the extras that are in the Apocrypha about Esther, and you can read what's going on. And We know where she fits. What is going on in captivity? The devil's trying to kill all the Jews because God's already promised they're going to come back. What was determined upon them? 70 years. Now, I don't know if you can flip back, but in there is the 70 years, okay? And it's actually back one more. 70, well, actually, I was wrong. Flip back one more, back where you were. When they got taken here, where do the 70 years start? I actually say the 70 years start in 609 BC. That's what I say. I am willing to be proven wrong, and I will not sit and argue for it like I say you must be born again. I will not. But 609 BC, 70 years gets you to a year called 539 BC. What happened in 539 BC? Cyrus made a decree that all the Jews could go back. So 70 years were determined. Jeremiah 25, you can read the whole thing. I had it all set to kind of read all of it, but I just wouldn't have had time to do it. You read it and you talk about the 70 years. So that's what's going on in all this time in Nebuchadnezzar from 609, which is back before this, and all until this time over here, 539, that's what happens. And there is a 70-year period, and they know about that 70-year period. What occurs then is Cyrus makes a decree to go back. And what Daniel is doing at that point is he's still in Babylon. He's very old at this point. In fact, he's more than 70 because he lasted through the whole 70-year period. So this Daniel, this righteous man who got taken as a young man in 609 and taken into captivity, 70 years after that, he's still there operating. And he knows by books, as we'll read later, that it's near the end of the time. And in that period of time, God has dealt with all the nations all around. He's dealt with them all. And they've all been humbled. And they've all been brought under the rule of Babylon. And what's happening right at this point that we are, after Belshazzar's little feast, what's happening is that Babylon has been completely taken over by the Persians. Now, Cyrus had been king of the Persians for some time. He'd been king of the Medes for some time. But he wasn't king of Babylon until he conquered it. And it was at that point that he makes a decree. And when Daniel talks about the first year of Cyrus the Persian, he's talking about the first year of Cyrus the Persian as king of Babylon. Okay? And that's important because we all know, everybody who knows anything about history, that he was king way back here. Okay, and whatever year that was, because it's all fuzzy up here and I can't read it, but I forget the number, but it's like some number quite a bit before 539. And you'll be able to read it. He was king, 559 to 530. That's his reign. Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you, man. And this is the father-in-law, Astyages, is the guy who he deposed as being king of the Medes and took them over both because he married Astyages' daughter. Probably married other daughters too, but that was a big one. There's where it says he married her. In 546, he defeats Croesus of Lydia in this certain battle. It's also very famous. You know, there's all kinds of things in here. This is 2 Kings 25:27, where evil Merodach or Ammo-Marduk raises up Jehoiakim. The whole point is for you to begin to look and see how accurate the Bible is. Everything it says happened. Even though there's a lot of people who argue with some of this, it's this stuff they don't argue with. Everybody knows this is real. And Cyrus has been king for a long time, but he's not king of Babylon. And it's not until he becomes king of Babylon that he can free all the Jews. And that's when he does it. And in that time, in the first year of being king of Babylon, he makes a decree. It's a very famous decree. The first and second books of Esdras, we'll talk about it quite a bit. We will discuss briefly about how they dig it up later. Many, many years after it's made, they find it. There's this decree, and they have to dig for it, and they find it and say, wow, look, this was this decree, and because they're giving them a hard time about building the walls. And, you know, when you're talking about Ezra and Nehemiah and the prophets that prophesied with them, and Joshua, the son of Josedek, and all those guys, I mean, they're all in there. They're in the first and second book of Esdras and all that, and we'll explain where that comes from. But I want you to understand that we have just done Babylon. Babylon is the third of the 8 kingdoms that God talks about that are coming. We know the first was Egypt, the second was Assyria, Babylon. We are now finished with Babylon. And we're going to understand more about that when we get to Daniel, because now Daniel's learned all this over his entire lifetime. He served in Babylon. And in that time, he has, saved Susanna from getting killed. He's shown that Bel was false. He's testified to Nebuchadnezzar of who God is multiple times. The 3 friends of his have testified to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has been humbled a number of times, and even to the point of having a mania for a while that actually happened. Right there, Daniel 4, which we read, Nebuchadnezzar's mania. And he testifies of how great God is. That's where we are. Next step, the Medo-Persian Empire. And Daniel begins to cry out to God, I want to know. And he asks some questions. And he's going to ask a bunch of them, and there's going to be a few of them that God doesn't answer. And he answers those in the book of Revelation. But that's for another time. So, anybody have any questions? Everybody following okay? I'm trying to make this real simple. So go ahead and download it, play with it. Question?
So Belshazzar,
Yes.
it says there that there are like 2 people born.
And it says he's a son of Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah, something like
Is that the question?
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Why is he a son when there's like 3 kings in between him and Nebuchadnezzar, right? Because they're using the word son there as in a descendant of.
Okay.
That's really what it means.
Like ancestor.
Ancestor. Nebuchadnezzar was so great, he's so mighty that they look at him as the great king. Remember, he was the head of gold. The guys that came after him, they're like has-beens. They're nobodies. They really are. And they don't have any great things that they did. They didn't conquer anything. All they watched was their empire start to shrink. And the Medes went, well, we're done with these people, and they went and joined with the Persians. They took over with Cyrus, because Cyrus was the guy. Okay? And you're going to see this throughout all of it. When God moves to set something up, just like we're going to read in Daniel about how the angel says to him that we had to go and put down the prince of Persia so the prince of Grecia could come. He's talking about angelic things that are going on. When God said Cyrus has taken over, Cyrus took over. He became the great guy who God's dealing with now. And he eventually conquers Babylon and moves on. Just like Alexander the Great will conquer the Medes and the Persians. And just like Rome will take over from the descendants of Alexander the Great. And we'll talk about all that. Okay. Praise God, we got through that. We're going to do chapter 6 next time. And it's just going to get more and more fun as far as I'm concerned. It just gets absolutely exciting to link the history up. So I hope you have fun with it. I spent a lot of time putting that together to try to make it as simple as possible. And be careful that you look at the top at what year, because they don't all go the same distance.
Is that on the...
It's online. It's already there. And you can print it out. It's just basically a PDF of a spreadsheet, because that's what I use to do it. And I think it's pretty clear. If you get into the Egypt stuff, I actually shrunk the Egypt stuff because I just don't want you to spend a lot of time with that, because the Egypt stuff is I could spend an entire class just talking about Egyptian history and what's wrong with it and all of that kind of stuff. And so if you spend a lot of time thinking about it, it'll just kind of drive you nuts. But you'll be able to see where I feel like everything lines up and makes perfect sense. But most people, the Nebuchadnezzar stuff, there's no argument about that. There's just no argument. It's all very clear. And so that's why I made that the clear point for tonight. Okay. So it's going to get more fun. Any other questions while we're at it? Anybody else have anything else they want to say?